What if the Korean War had united the peninsula? What if the Korean War had ended not with an armistice, but with unification, under one banner, one government, and one people? What if the 38th parallel had vanished not in ink, but in fire and steel? What would the world look like if, in the summer of 1953, the Korean Peninsula emerged as one nation, either red or blue, but not both? To answer that, we must begin with what truly happened. The Korean War was never officially a war, at least not in name. It was branded a police action, a bitter euphemism for a conflict that took more than 2 million lives in just 3 years. When Japanese colonial rule ended in 1945, Korea, like a broken bone, was split by four insurgents: America in the south, the Soviet Union in the north. Two ideologies, capitalism and communism, raced to reshape a land that had never asked for division. By 1950, tensions boiled over. The North, under Kim Il-sung, backed by Soviet tanks and Chinese approval, launched a surprise invasion on June 25th. Seoul fell in 3 days. The South, unprepared and disorganized, seemed destined to collapse. But then came the U.S. intervention, spearheaded by General Douglas MacArthur. The counterattack at Incheon turned the tide, pushing North Korean forces nearly to the Chinese border. But hubris invites consequence. As UN forces approached the Yalu River, China entered the war, unleashing a tidal wave of soldiers and dragging the conflict into a brutal stalemate. The 38th parallel became a bloody no-man's land. And in 1953, an armistice, not a peace treaty, froze the war in place. Korea remained split, suspended in tension, like a clenched jaw that never truly relaxed. Now imagine something else. In this alternate thread of history, one small thread snaps and changes everything. It's early 1951. Instead of ignoring Chinese warnings, the U.S. High Command listens. MacArthur is reined in before his provocations pulled China into the war. The UN, still holding momentum from Incheon, reinforces its gains more cautiously, but diplomacy wins an unlikely ally. Stalin dies 2 years early, in 1951, not 1953, throwing the Soviet Union into temporary disarray. Bereft of Moscow's full support, China hesitates. Mao sees the risks, but without Stalin's insistence, he chooses restraint over escalation. And just like that, history swerves. With no Chinese intervention, the North Korean People's Army collapses by spring 1951. Pyongyang falls. Kim Il-sung is captured, tried in a UN military tribunal, and publicly denounced by his own defectors. The Korean Peninsula, now under UN control, prepares for something no one expected: reunification. But here's where it gets complex. Reunification doesn't mean peace. It means reconstruction, political chaos, and occupation. The South, though nominally in charge, is weak and traumatized. The North is a smoldering ruin. The world watches with bated breath as a new Korea is born, not out of consensus, but conquest. As 1952 dawns, the United States and its allies must decide: do they establish a democratic Korea, impose a military government, or allow Syngman Rhee's authoritarianism to harden across the entire peninsula? Meanwhile, in Beijing, Mao seethes. His chance to dominate Asia through the Korean buffer is gone. And in Moscow, the vacuum of Stalin's death has left Soviet ambitions fractured. Yet the embers of resentment remain. And as American tanks rumble through the streets of Wonsan and Hungnam, a new Cold War front opens, not frozen at the 38th parallel, but poised across the Yellow Sea. A united Korea in 1952 was not a celebration. It was a funeral with a promise. Across the war-torn peninsula, cities lay in ruin. Seoul, recaptured twice, was a skeleton of its former self. Its bridges collapsed, its neighborhoods cratered. Pyongyang, once the political heart of the North, was reduced to a scorched monument of lost ideology. From Busan to Sinuiju, the land bore the scars of bullets and bombs. But in this alternate history, beneath the ashes, something rare stirred, the fragile possibility of rebirth. The international community, flush with victory but wary of chaos, poured in. The United Nations established the Korean Reconstruction Commission, led primarily by the United States, but also involving Britain, France, and even neutral nations like Sweden and India. Their mission was clear: rebuild, reform, and prevent collapse. But nothing was ever simple in Korea. The first obstacle wasn't infrastructure, it was ideology. South Korea's president, Syngman Rhee, wasted no time declaring himself the rightful leader of the reunified Korea. But Rhee was no champion of democracy. A staunch anti-communist, educated in the U.S., but molded by authoritarian instincts, he sought to crush all remnants of the North's identity. He disbanded the North Korean People's Committees, banned the Workers' Party, and launched a sweeping purge of suspected collaborators. Tens of thousands were arrested. Many simply disappeared. In the streets of Hamhung, leaflets fluttered through the air. "Rejoice! Korea is free!" But the faces of those reading them were hollow. In cities like Cheongjin and Kaesong, former citizens of the North found themselves treated not as brothers, but as threats. Their accents betrayed them. Their silence condemned them. Reunification had come through conquest, not consent, and the resentment was growing. Yet, amid the political darkness, flickers of hope emerged. American engineers began rebuilding bridges over the Han River. Swedish doctors set up mobile clinics in Hwanghae. Students in both North and South studied in shared classrooms, some for the first time in years, reading books in Hangul instead of Japanese or Russian. A single electricity grid connected the peninsula for the first time since colonial times. Radio broadcasts from Seoul now reached Mount Paektu, though some villagers whispered that they still heard the voices of the North at night. But underneath this fragile recovery, two great powers watched with clenched jaws: China and the Soviet Union. To Mao Zedong, Korea's unification was a geopolitical humiliation. He had allowed the North to fall, and in doing so, surrendered the buffer that protected Manchuria from American influence. U.S. bases now stood only miles from the Yalu River. And worse, the Korean people, once seen as potential allies in the Communist Revolution, were slipping permanently into the Western orbit. Moscow, meanwhile, was reeling. Stalin's early death in 1951 had triggered a leadership vacuum. Lavrenti Beria, the secretive and feared head of the NKVD, made a short-lived bid for power, only to be overthrown by a coalition led by Nikita Khrushchev. The Soviet Union, distracted and disorganized, offered no support to the retreating North Koreans, and now watched helplessly as America reshaped the peninsula before their eyes. But if Moscow could not act overtly, it could still sabotage from within. By mid-1953, whispers of resistance began surfacing in the mountains of Kangwon and the slums of Pyongyang. Former North Korean officers, spared from purges but not from bitterness, formed underground networks. A new name emerged among the shadows: Choi Myung-jin, a former major in the KPA, now turned insurgent leader. His message: Korea is united but under the wrong flag. A new kind of war was beginning, not of armies, but of hearts. Meanwhile, Syngman Rhee, emboldened by the West's support and the absence of foreign threats, tightened his grip. His national security law gave authorities sweeping powers. Newspapers critical of his government vanished overnight. Students protesting corruption were labeled red sympathizers and detained without trial. For the South, victory had become a mandate for oppression. And yet, the people were not entirely silent. In the streets of Seoul, artists began painting murals calling for reconciliation, not just reunification. In Gwangju, a group of young intellectuals formed a movement. Hanmeum, One Mind. Their vision was radical, not a Korea divided between winners and losers, but one that acknowledged the traumas of both sides. Their message spread through underground pamphlets and whispered sermons. And for the first time, some dared to ask, what does it mean to be Korean? Not South, not North, but whole. But as 1954 approached, storm clouds gathered again. In a secret meeting in Vladivostok, Soviet intelligence shared dossiers with Chinese generals. They weren't just watching Korea. They were planning. Unified or not, the peninsula was now a threat to both their borders and their influence. And in Washington, whispers grew louder. Could Korea become the next West Germany? Prosperous, armed, and one missile away from a broader war? The fragile peace was cracking. By 1954, Korea stood not as a healed nation, but as a haunted one. The capital had officially moved back to Seoul, gleaming with a rush of American dollars, rebuilding projects, and television antennas that blinked like fireflies over concrete rooftops. But in the north, Pyongyang was a ghost town. Once the ideological capital of Juche and revolution, now it served as a reluctant provincial center under surveillance and suspicion. But Pyongyang was not silent. It was seething. Underground cells had formed, most of them loosely organized, operating in isolated cells. But they had something far more dangerous than weapons: memory. Memory of land lost, of leaders executed, of promises betrayed. And among them, one name grew louder in whispers: Choi Myung-jin. A former major in the Korean People's Army, Choi had evaded capture during the fall of Pyongyang. He had witnessed his commander's suicide beneath a collapsed bunker and carried with him a bitterness that refused to die. But Choi was no reckless revolutionary. He was disciplined, ideological, and patient. He believed that the South Korean government was a foreign puppet, and that one day the people would rise. In 1954, his chance came. The northern provinces, stripped of industry and status, had become economically stagnant. Reconstruction efforts were focused almost exclusively in the south and coastal cities. Factories in Hamhung remained shuttered. Rail lines near Musan rusted in place. Meanwhile, government officials from Seoul were resettling southern families in the north, offering them land, homes, and opportunities, while native northerners starved in silence. This tension exploded in June 1954, when a local protest in Sinuiju over food distribution turned violent. Armed only with farming tools and stolen rifles from a decommissioned KPA depot, a group of villagers clashed with police. Dozens were killed. The government called it banditry, but Choi Myung-jin called it a spark. He sent his followers to infiltrate labor camps and mining collectives, distributing leaflets printed on stolen paper presses. The message was simple: Korea is not free until the North chooses its future. By autumn, a coordinated wave of sabotage hit the region. Power lines near Cheongjen were cut, delaying reconstruction. A weapons cache from the war, buried and forgotten in the Taebaek Mountains, was unearthed and redistributed. In 1 week alone, 6 government buildings were bombed, none causing mass casualties, but each shaking the illusion of unity. President Ri responded predictably, with fire and fear. Martial law was declared in North Hamgyong. Thousands were arrested, many tortured, some publicly executed in village squares. U.S. advisors warned restraint, but Ri ignored them. He saw no difference between resistance and rebellion. But the repression only fed the insurgency. Every widow, every orphan, every prison cell became a recruiting ground for Choi's movement, now calling itself the True Korea Front. Meanwhile, the rest of the world watched the peninsula with growing concern. In Beijing, Mao Zedong felt vindicated. "They've conquered the land," he said to his generals, but not the people. He authorized increased border patrols and covert support. Chinese operatives began slipping across the Yalu disguised as refugees, carrying money, radios, and explosives. The Soviet Union, eager to reassert influence after Stalin's death, quietly followed suit. A few crates of arms made their way into Korea through Vladivostok. A few advisors arrived, not in uniforms, but as fishermen and truck drivers. The Cold War had returned to Korea, not as a war of armies, but of proxies, propaganda, and guerrillas. By early 1955, Seoul was under siege, not from outside, but from within. Explosions rocked the city's rail yards. a bomb detonated outside the Ministry of Reunification. A high-profile assassination attempt on Minister Han Byung-seok narrowly failed, but it sent a clear message. The insurgency was no longer confined to the north. Even more dangerous than the bombs was the doubt. Whispers began spreading among the youth in Busan and Daegu. Was the war really over? Were the Northerners truly the enemy? Or were they victims of history, scapegoats in a conflict larger than any of them? University students began staging vigils for Northern civilians killed in raids. A banned book, The Two Koreas, One Soul, Two Wounds, circulated in mimeographed pages, offering a humanized view of the fallen North. Syngman Rhee was furious. He ordered the expulsion of foreign journalists. Press censorship was tightened. The National Security Agency gained expanded powers, including indefinite detention. But repression could no longer seal the cracks. The more Rhee tried to control the narrative, the more the truth slipped through. The United States, now caught in a moral dilemma, began to pull back. Korea had been unified under democracy, yes, but at what cost? American senators debated cutting reconstruction funding. Protests erupted in New York and London. "Is this the Korea we fought for?" asked one editorial in the New York Times. And all the while, Choi Myung-jin waited, not for foreign aid nor for a military victory. He waited for Korea to grow tired of unity imposed by force. He believed that time would erode the illusion, and that when it did, the people would come to him. By late 1955, the peninsula stood on the brink once more, unified in name, divided in soul, haunted by ghosts on both sides of the DMZ that never was. And in the mountains of Kangwon, a new insurgent flag fluttered in the icy wind, red, black, and unnamed. By the spring of 1956, Korea was no longer a battlefield, but it was far from peace, a fragile, paper-thin republic stretched from the DMZ's ghost line all the way to Jeju's shores. On maps, it was one Korea. In spirit, it was many. The North, sullen and scarred, whispered of resistance. The South, basking in Reconstruction wealth, wrestled with an invisible war of ideas. But somewhere in between, in lecture halls, city streets, and factory floors, a new front was opening. One the government couldn't bomb into silence. The youth were restless. At Korea University in Seoul, students staged a silent protest against the national security law. A single student stood on campus steps with a sign, "Truth is not treason." He was arrested within minutes, but the image of his defiance spread like wildfire. In Daegu, underground newspapers accused the Rhee regime of war crimes against civilians in the north. In Gwangju, a mural of a hand tearing the peninsula apart was whitewashed by authorities, only to reappear the next night, larger and bolder. These weren't isolated acts, they were signals. Beneath the government's iron grip, a generation born into war was demanding a voice in the peace. They had seen too much to trust blindly. They questioned not just the violence, but the silence. Why was unity so fragile? Why were Northerners denied opportunity? Why was dissent equated with disloyalty? The answers came, harsh and fast. In June 1956, Syngman Rhee ordered a national crackdown. Universities were placed under surveillance. Professors suspected of leftist sympathies were fired. Student leaders vanished into military detention centers. Some returned broken, others didn't return at all. The government branded them intellectual terrorists. But the damage was done. In trying to silence the youth, Rhee had given them a cause. And so, from ashes once more, a movement was born. They called themselves the Spring Society. Neither pro-communist nor pro-Rhee, they demanded something radical for their time: genuine democracy, regional equity, and transitional justice for all war crimes, North and South. Their manifesto, smuggled out of Seoul and published in Tokyo, became a lightning rod. International journalists, long expelled, now returned in secret to document the unrest. Washington grew increasingly uneasy. Rhee had once been their man, staunch, anti-communist, American educated. But now he was a liability. President Eisenhower privately described him as more stubborn than Stalin, less predictable than Mao. The CIA's Seoul station began sending discreet cables. Rhee's grip weakens. Youth uprising imminent. Consider succession planning. And yet, Rhee refused to relinquish control. In November 1956, he declared his intention to run for another term, his third. Opposition parties, long hollowed out by years of suppression, attempted to regroup. But none were strong enough to challenge the Rhee machine. The election, predictably, was rigged. The result? 93% victory. But no one celebrated, not even his allies. Then the spark came. January 1957. A government convoy transporting political prisoners to a re-education center near Chuncheon was ambushed. 10 guards were killed. 6 prisoners escaped. It wasn't the deadliest attack, but it was the boldest yet in the South. For the first time, the insurgency had crossed ideological lines. No longer confined to the northern mountains, it now had sympathizers among disillusioned youth, displaced workers, even former military officers. Rishi responded with brute force. Entire districts of Seoul were put under curfew. Military patrols roamed the streets. New detention camps were built, quietly outside the public eye. But still, protests grew. And then, an unexpected voice joined the rising chorus. Vice President Chang Myon, a Catholic moderate and longtime rival of Rhee. Chang had long stayed in the president's shadow. But now, he stepped into the light. In a public radio address, broadcast only once before the station was shut down, he said, "If we have defeated one tyranny only to build another, then our war never truly ended. Unity is not made with guns and slogans. It is made with truth." The address stunned the nation. Within days, students flooded the streets. In Busan, thousands marched with candles. In Seoul, banners read, "We survived war. We will not die in silence." Government buildings were stormed. Police forces, many sympathetic to the protesters, hesitated to intervene. Some even defected. For the first time since unification, the Rhee regime was truly threatened. In desperation, Rishi sought help from the United States, but Washington, facing re-election tensions at home and escalating crises in the Middle East, refused direct military involvement. Eisenhower's final message was diplomatic but clear: reform or be replaced. But Rhee would not go quietly. In March 1957, he ordered the arrest of Chang Myon for treason. Riots exploded across the country. The army, facing orders to fire on civilians, fractured. Some units followed Rhee. Others mutinied. On the night of April 2nd, an explosion tore through the Blue House gates. Rhee survived, but the message was unmistakable. Korea, once unified by war, now faced the prospect of internal collapse. The revolution had begun, not with foreign tanks, but with Korean hands. And deep in the mountains, Choi Myung-jin watched from the shadows. He had waited for this moment, not to fight, but to be welcomed. April 1957. The streets of Seoul reeked of smoke and sweat, the scent of revolution. Syngman Rhee had lost control not only of his government, but of the very illusion that he represented Korea's future. His armored convoys moved through the city like relics of a bygone war, while crowds surged around them, chanting not slogans of communism, nor loyalty to a foreign power, but simply, Korea for Koreans. The uprising that had started with students now engulfed the working class, veterans, and rural farmers, who had long lived in the shadow of the South's rapid reconstruction. Northern provinces, treated as conquered territories since unification, were erupting in their own form of rebellion, not in the name of ideology, but in resentment of decades of exclusion. Two movements, both against Rhee, now roared from opposite ends of the peninsula. The army stood divided. In the south, General Baek Do-hyun, a rising star within the military establishment, refused to use force on civilians. His refusal emboldened defectors within the officer corps. Some battalions sealed off Seoul, not to protect Rhee, but to isolate him. In the north, government forces clashed with the True Korea Front, Choi Myung-jin's insurgencies that had gained ground in Gangwon and North Hamgyong. But now, It was no longer clear who controlled what. For the first time since unification, the Republic of Korea had no functioning chain of command. Ri, paranoid and aging, barricaded himself in the Blue House. He refused all calls for resignation. In secret, he ordered loyalists in the security service to prepare contingency operations, plans that included the arrest or assassination of opposition leaders, media blackouts, and even martial law across the entire peninsula. But it was too late. The world was watching, and America had had enough. In early May, a special envoy arrived in Seoul from Washington. His name, George F. Kennan, the architect of the U.S. containment strategy. His presence was a signal. America no longer saw Korea as a buffer, but as a potential flashpoint. In private meetings with General Beck and Vice President Chang Mayon, recently freed by protesting civilians, Kennan laid out a brutal truth. If Ri stays, Korea burns. If he falls, we may yet preserve what was won in war. For the first time since unification, U.S. support tilted away from Ri. But removing him would not be easy. Ri's intelligence network still held the capital's communication lines. His inner circle, though shrinking, remained fiercely loyal. And worse, rumors swirled that he had given a final order, a military strike against northern provinces under insurgent control, under the pretense of restoring unity. But many believed it was no more than revenge. Then came the breaking point, May 14, 1957. A train carrying student leaders from Seoul to Gwangju was derailed in Jeolla province. Dozens killed. Government sources claimed sabotage. But the public believed otherwise, that it was an assassination, a warning, perhaps even a false flag operation by Ri's loyalists. The next day, the capital erupted. Over 200,000 civilians flooded Gwanghwamun Square. It was no longer protest. It was a revolution. Barricades rose, police stations were seized, fire spread through the Ministry of Defense building, Ri's portrait was torn down and burned in public, and in a single night, the myth of the great liberator crumbled into ash. General Beck, now backed quietly by the U.S., made his move. On May 18th, military units under his command surrounded the Blue House. There was no siege, no bloodshed. Ri's guards, tired and disillusioned, stood down. And in the early hours of May 19th, Syngman Ri, founder of the Republic, the man who once dreamed of ruling a unified Korea, was flown under American escort to exile in Hawaii. He would never return. The revolution had succeeded, but now came the harder task, rebuilding again. Vice President Chang Myon was sworn in as acting president. General Baek was promoted to Chief of National Defense. The United States restored full aid under the condition of democratic elections within 1 year. The world applauded, but beneath the applause, tremors remained. In the north, Choi Myung-jin watched the collapse of the Ri regime with silent fury. He did not see victory. He saw betrayal. His goal had never been liberal democracy. It had been justice for the North, for his fallen comrades, for the dream of a Korea not owned by foreigners or their puppets. And so, even as the streets of Seoul cheered, the mountains of Hamgyong braced for the next phase. Insurgents struck again, this time not just with bombs, but with declarations. A radio station in Ryanggang broadcast a chilling message: the South has replaced one tyrant with another, the North does not kneel. Chang Myon, now in charge, faced an impossible task: unify the country not by force, but by trust. He launched a national reconciliation initiative, amnesty for insurgents who laid down arms, economic assistance for northern provinces, Shansemis, and truth commissions to address wartime atrocities. But Choi refused the olive branch. To him, peace without justice was another kind of occupation. And as the summer of 1957 wore on, Korea stood on the knife's edge again, not split by foreign lines, but by the invisible scars of memory, pride, and pain. The Korean Peninsula, now technically whole, had reached a crossroads more perilous than war itself. It was the summer of 1957. The dictator was gone. The crowds had cheered, The world applauded Korea's democratic turn. But underneath the headlines and diplomatic courtesies lay something far more unstable. Two nations occupying the same soil, sharing the same flag, yet unable to look each other in the eye. Acting President Chang Myon understood the risk. A veteran statesman, devout Catholic, and soft-spoken reformist, he knew he was walking through a minefield of expectations. The North had been neglected, punished, and alienated for years. The South, flush with aid and development, saw itself as the real Korea. If reconciliation was to mean anything, it would have to begin with an uncomfortable truth. No one had truly won. And so came the boldest gamble of the new republic, the Reconciliation Initiative. It began modestly. Fact-finding commissions were dispatched to northern provinces to document the scale of war crimes and post-war suppression. Government officials visited Pyongyang, not to inspect or command, but to listen. Infrastructure funds were redirected from Seoul's skyscrapers to North Korea's ruined roads and collapsed factories. And most radical of all, a proposal for transitional justice, open to both victims of communism and victims of the South's post-war purges. In theory, it was revolutionary. In practice, it was chaos. Former North Korean civil servants, long in hiding, were offered limited political amnesty. Some returned and were met with suspicion. Others were killed by vigilantes before they could even speak. In Gyeonggang, protests erupted over what locals called rewarding traitors. In Pyongyang, murals reappeared with Choi Myung-jin's image painted over symbols of unity. The country was not healing. It was remembering. Still, Chang pressed on. He invited international observers, Norwegian judges, Indian diplomats, and Argentine human rights activists to oversee the truth commissions. For a moment, the world saw Korea not as a battlefield or backwater, but as a moral experiment. Could a nation divided by war reconcile through truth, not vengeance? But not everyone agreed with the answer. In the shadows, Choi Myung-jin intensified his operations. No longer content with sabotage and insurgency, he began to infiltrate civil society. His movement, once ragtag, now had structure. The Northern Restoration Front, as it called itself, published underground newspapers, organized strikes in reindustrializing cities like Hamhung, and built networks within disillusioned military units. Then came the assassination. October 12, 1957. Kim Dae-ho, a former northern mayor turned reconciliation advisor, was killed outside his home in Pyongyang. Shot twice in the chest, once in the head. A message carved into his door. Traitor to none. Servant of the false. The nation recoiled. For many in the North, Kim had symbolized cautious hope. His death ignited panic and fury. Chang Myon faced his hardest decision yet. Under pressure from both the military and the public, he declared a state of regional emergency in North Hamgyong and Ryanggang. The army was deployed, but under new rules of engagement: no reprisals, no extrajudicial arrests, strict civilian oversight. His goal was to prevent escalation, but it was already too late. The Northern Restoration Front struck hard and fast. Train lines were bombed near the Chinese border. Aid shipments were hijacked and redistributed under Choi's banner. Schools teaching revised national history were burned. In Hyesan, a government office was overtaken and its workers executed, broadcasted via pirate radio as a warning to collaborators. And yet, in Seoul, whispers began to circulate. Was Chang too weak? The conservative bloc, led by remnants of the Re-loyalists and hardline military officers, accused him of appeasement. They called the Reconciliation Initiative a national humiliation, a betrayal of those who had fought and died to unify the country. On the streets, patriotic militias began forming under names like the Iron Banner and Defenders of the Flame. They wore blue armbands, carried batons, and vowed to finish what the war started. Korea was on the verge of civil fracture, not between North and South, but between those who wanted justice and those who wanted revenge. Meanwhile, foreign powers circled like vultures. In Moscow, Khrushchev saw an opportunity if the Korean left could be rearmed, not under old Stalinist lines, but as a populist revolt, It could fracture America's gains in Asia. Advisors were dispatched covertly to Manchuria. Radio broadcasts in Korean resumed, this time with new slogans: not red, not blue, just free. In Beijing, Mao remained cautious. He had been burned once before. But he offered tacit aid to border groups: fuel, food, and medical supplies. His goal was not conquest, but containment. A unified, democratic Korea on his doorstep was intolerable. If it couldn't be undone, it would be destabilized. By winter, Korea was holding together by threads fraying at both ends. The Reconciliation Initiative, once a bold moral venture, had become a liability. International support was waning. U.S. officials, especially under the new Eisenhower successor administration, questioned Korea's stability. Aid packages shrank. Advisors were recalled. And inside the country, Chang Myon-'s approval fell with every newsreel of insurgent victories. But the final blow didn't come from Choi. It came from within. December 28, 1957. A failed military coup attempt by hardliners in Busan left 20 dead and a nation shocked. Though quickly suppressed by loyal forces, it shattered any illusion of cohesion. The Republic of Korea, unified by war, liberated by protest, was now a wounded state bleeding from within. By the start of 1958, the illusion that Korea had been made whole was unraveling. The country, once mapped neatly with one flag and one name, now seemed to be splitting at the seams, not along latitude lines, but ideological fault lines, internal rivalries, and foreign interference that refused to die. President Chang Myon, once hailed as the cautious hope of post-Korea, now stood at the center of a tightening storm. The Northern insurgency, led by Choi Myung-jin and his Northern Restoration Front, was growing bolder and bloodier. The assassination of provincial leaders had become routine. In cities like Hamhung and Sinuiju, local officials refused to travel without armored escorts. In rural areas, central government control had all but vanished. The front collected taxes, distributed food, even ran impromptu trials in makeshift people's courts. In many regions, it was not the Republic's flag, but Choi's tricolor, red, black, and white, that flew above town halls. And then came the defection. In March 1958, Colonel Lee Sang-woo, commander of a Northern Army division, defected to the insurgency, bringing with him not just troops, but weapons, maps, and internal communications. He cited moral rot in Seoul's government and betrayal of the North's dignity. His defection was a turning point. For the first time, the insurgents had heavy arms, tanks, artillery, radios, and trained officers to wield them. The front line was no longer symbolic. Korea was on the brink of civil war. But Choi Myung-jin wasn't the only enemy. In the south, the failed coup in Busan had not extinguished the hardliners. It had galvanized them. Calling themselves the Flame Legion, these remnants of Rhee's secret police and ultra-nationalist militias began operating underground. Their creed was simple: Korea must be purified. The northern provinces were irredeemable. Democracy was weakness. Reconciliation was treason. In cities like Daejeon and Gwangju, targeted assassinations of reformist journalists and liberal politicians increased. Bombings of student gatherings were blamed on leftist factions, but evidence pointed elsewhere. The Flame Legion had no front lines, no uniforms, but their fingerprints were found wherever chaos bloomed. Between the insurgents in the north and the hardliners in the south, Chang Myon-'s government became a narrow bridge over a boiling sea. And the weight of holding the republic together was beginning to break him. Internationally, Korea's plight was now a geopolitical game piece. The United States, now under President John F. Kennedy, was torn. On one hand, Kennedy admired Korea's democratic aspirations and believed in supporting anti-communist governments. On the other, the American public was weary. The Korean experiment was bleeding credibility, and midterm elections loomed. Behind closed doors, the National Security Council debated alternatives: support for a military caretaker government, covert support to moderate insurgents, who might oppose both extremes, or, worst of all, withdrawal. Moscow, meanwhile, smelled blood. Khrushchev, fresh from a propaganda victory in launching Sputnik, decided it was time to reopen the Korean theater, not as direct intervention, but through arms shipments and advisors sent via Manchuria. Soviet-made rifles and mortars began appearing in Choi Myung-jin's raids. A small number of East German and Czech instructors began training insurgent radio operators and engineers. China, more cautious after the Korean humiliation years earlier, preferred shadow games. Mao's intelligence services funneled funding to both Choi and certain hardliner factions in the South, intending not victory for either, but the erosion of the Korean state as a whole. A divided, chaotic Korea was far more tolerable than a stable one aligned with Washington. The Republic, caught between insurgency and extremism, between Soviet ambition and American fatigue, turned to its last weapon, truth. In April 1958, President Chong addressed the nation. It was not a rousing speech. It was raw, desperate, human. "We have won the war, but we have not won the peace. We are surrounded by ghosts, of the North, of the South, of the past. If we do not find common cause as Koreans, we will be nothing more than a vessel for foreign dreams and foreign graves." The speech resonated, but too faintly. Trust had eroded. Young Koreans, raised in years of violence and ideology, no longer knew what reconciliation looked like. They had been raised to hate communism, or to hate occupation, or to hate betrayal, but not to build. And then came the final blow of the year. In August, a coordinated offensive by the Northern Restoration Front seized control of 3 cities, Wonsan, Hwaryong, and Samjeon. In a single week, government forces, under-equipped and under-trained, were routed. The insurgents declared these areas autonomous Korean liberation zones and broadcast messages urging mass defection. The Republic responded with airstrikes. Civilian casualties were high. Protests erupted in Seoul, not against the insurgents, but against the government. Parents demanded to know why their sons were dying in a war that had supposedly ended years ago. The Peninsula, once united by a victory no one could define, now burned at both ends. Chang Myon, now a tired man, stood alone atop the architecture of a collapsing state. The people were losing faith. The military was split. Foreign powers were gambling with blood not their own. And in a mountain bunker outside Hyesan, Choi Myung-jin smiled. His war was never about conquering the South. It was about proving it never truly owned the North. By October 1958, the illusion of post-war unification had finally shattered. No declaration came. No formal lines were drawn. But everyone knew the Second Korean War had begun. It started with silence. Government troops stationed in Nin near the insurgent-held city of Wonsan stopped receiving orders. Their radios hissed with static. Then came the bombardments, mortars pounding outlying districts, followed by the insurgents' surprise ground offensive. This wasn't guerrilla warfare anymore. The Northern Restoration Front moved like a standing army. Choi Myung-jin had waited years for this moment. He had trained his fighters not only in sabotage, but in structured assault. His ranks were swelled with defected soldiers, conscripted workers, and northern youth radicalized by years of marginalization. His weapon stockpiles, fed quietly by the Soviet bloc and opportunistic Chinese smugglers, were enough to field battalions. In 3 weeks, he captured 6 major northern cities. In each one, a similar scene played out. Local government officials fled or were executed. Schools were taken over, flags changed and radio stations broadcast his voice. He called it not a revolution, but a return to justice. He framed his campaign not as a war against the South, but as a liberation of the North from Southern tyranny. Seoul, reeling, mobilized in disarray. President Chang Myon convened the National Assembly in emergency session. A general mobilization was declared, and the Republic's remaining military assets were deployed northward. But it was already clear. The army was fractured. Entire divisions questioned whether they were defending a nation or putting down their fellow Koreans. Desertions surged. In Busan, anti-war protests paralyzed rail movement. Across the country, citizens asked the question no leader dared say aloud. Is this Korea's civil war? The answer came in blood. In December 1958, government forces attempted to retake Wonsan. The offensive was poorly coordinated and under-equipped. Choi's fighters, dug into fortified positions, repelled the assault. Hundreds died. A captured Southern lieutenant was paraded through the streets, not as a prisoner, but as a warning. Unity by force is no unity at all. International reaction was swift and divided. In Washington, President Kennedy faced mounting pressure. The U.S. had poured billions into rebuilding Korea. To abandon it now would send a message to allies and enemies alike. Yet direct intervention risked inflaming the conflict into a broader proxy war. Secret meetings with Joint Chiefs produced a compromise. Limited military advisors would remain, but no American troops would be committed unless Seoul collapsed entirely. Instead, Kennedy turned to economic tools, cutting off aid until Seoul produced a viable plan for peace. "You cannot bomb your way to reconciliation," he told a press conference. But inside the White House, aides feared the truth. Korea had become a quagmire of America's own design. Moscow and Beijing played subtler games. The USSR, under Khrushchev's calculating hand, continued to arm Choi's forces, discreetly, through third-party channels and black market routes. East German journalists, embedded with insurgent media outlets, provided communication training. Czech advisors helped repair damaged industrial sites in insurgent territory, building legitimacy. China, ever wary, offered just enough to keep the fire burning: field medics, winter gear, and logistical intel. But Mao had no intention of a full-scale engagement. To him, Korea was valuable as a buffer, chaotic, fragmented, and dependent. A unified, peaceful Korea, whether capitalist or communist, was far more dangerous. Within Korea, the war mutated. It was not a war of front lines, but of districts, highways, and mines. Some towns changed hands weekly. Others declared neutrality. Militias emerged in central provinces, neither loyal to Seoul nor Choi. They called themselves guardians of the people or sons of Korea, depending on the village. But their true purpose was local survival. In practice, they extorted food, executed outsiders, and kept order at gunpoint. In Seoul, panic set in. President Chang, increasingly isolated, reshuffled his cabinet 3 times in 2 months. His generals contradicted one another in public briefings. His advisors disagreed on everything except that the republic was unraveling. There were whispers that General Beck, the hero of the post-Rhee transition, was considering a stabilization intervention. A coup in all but name. Then came the symbolic collapse. The Demilitarized Zone Museum, built as a monument to the war that never technically ended, was bombed in January 1959. No group claimed responsibility, but the message was clear. History's wounds were not healed, and the museum's narrative of unity was a lie. Amid the violence, one fragile hope flickered: a ceasefire summit. Organized in secret through Swedish intermediaries, the summit was proposed as a meeting between representatives of Seoul and Choi's movement, not to agree on reunification, but to prevent total collapse. Choi agreed to send envoys. So did Chang. They met in Kaesong, a bitterly symbolic place, just north of the old 38th parallel. For 3 days they spoke, but there was no handshake, no treaty, just demands. Choi's camp insisted on full autonomy for the northern provinces under his governance, amnesty for all insurgents, and withdrawal of southern troops from the north. Seoul refused. Chang offered regional elections and economic cooperation. Choi laughed. "You don't offer the fire a share in the forest," he said. "You put it out, or you let it burn." The summit collapsed. So did the last hope for negotiation. And as 1959 dawned, Korea found itself back where it started a decade earlier, except worse. Then, it had been divided by outside powers. Now, it was dividing itself. By mid-1959, the Korean Peninsula had become a fractured landscape of ruin and despair. The Second Korean War, though never formally declared, was a merciless conflict that bled towns, families, and memories dry. The battle lines had blurred beyond recognition. Neither Seoul's army nor Choi Myung-jin's insurgents could claim uncontested victory. Cities like Hamhung, once bustling industrial centers, were now ghost towns of burned-out factories and shattered hopes. The streets of Wonsan echoed with gunfire and silence, by turns refuge and battleground. Amid this chaos, the civilian population endured the worst. Food shortages crippled both north and south-controlled areas. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded, many untreated. Refugees flooded into border towns, desperate to escape crossfire or forced conscription. The winter of 1959 was particularly cruel. Homes burned, crops failed, and famine stalked the hills. In the south, the government's grip weakened as corruption spread. Military commanders, once loyal to President Chang Myon, began to carve out personal fiefdoms. Local warlords controlled regions under the guise of maintaining order. Taxation was arbitrary, often enriching soldiers and officials while leaving villagers destitute. Dissidents were silenced, but whispers of revolution grew louder. The Flame Legion, emboldened by the government's weakness, increased assassinations and sabotage campaigns. Yet their fanaticism alienated many Koreans who longed not for more bloodshed but for peace. In the north, the Northern Restoration Front faced its own crisis. While Choi Myung-jin's leadership was firm, his coalition was fracturing. Some commanders demanded harsher tactics. Others sought negotiated truces to rebuild devastated communities. The tension threatened to split the insurgency, weakening its hold on captured territories. Foreign powers remained watchers and players. Moscow continued to supply arms and advisors, but refused to send regular troops, wary of provoking a wider war. Beijing's support was limited but effective, especially in intelligence and border security. Meanwhile, Washington, exhausted by the endless conflict, reduced aid and focused on diplomatic containment. Amid the suffering, a new generation of Koreans began to question everything. Students, once fervent nationalists, grew cynical. Poets wrote verses about lost innocence. Artists painted desolate landscapes. Underground literature spread. Calls for peace. Calls for justice. Calls for a Korea beyond ideology. One such voice was Min Seo, a young woman from Seoul whose family had lost everything to war. She became part of the Hanmayam movement, a clandestine network of thinkers, students, and former soldiers advocating for reconciliation. Their slogan was simple yet daring: "Korea is more than our scars." Min Seo's writings circulated widely, smuggled past government censors. They questioned the endless cycle of violence and the meaning of identity in a land divided not just by borders, but by broken promises. Yet, for all this yearning, hope was fragile. The war dragged on with no end in sight. Each ceasefire call was met with renewed attacks. Propaganda intensified, painting the enemy as monsters, not neighbors. Families were torn apart, sometimes by blood, sometimes by ideology. In one harrowing incident in late 1959, a refugee convoy near the city of Chuncheon was ambushed by insurgents. Over 50 civilians perished. The massacre became a rallying cry for Seoul's government, which vowed retribution. In response, Choi's forces executed suspected government sympathizers in their strongholds. This tit-for-tat violence hardened hearts and widened the divide. International observers described Korea as a living hell, a nation caught between past wounds and future fears. But to many Koreans, it was simply home. Scarred, shattered, yet stubbornly alive. As 1960 dawned, the question hung in the air. Was this Korea, the Korea born of war, division, and false unity, truly worth saving? The year 1960 marked a dangerous turning point for Korea, a nation worn thin by endless conflict and fractured by competing visions of what it should be. The Southern government, led by President Chong Myon, was losing legitimacy fast. His efforts at reconciliation had failed to bring peace. Instead, they had opened old wounds and fueled suspicion. Corruption and incompetence plagued his administration. The military was divided, the economy stagnant, and the people restless. In the north, Choi Myung-jin's insurgency had morphed into something both militant and political. His vision of a just Korea had gained sympathy among war-weary civilians, but also brought devastating consequences. The frontline stalemate meant constant suffering. Everyday life was a war zone. Amid this turmoil, a new force emerged. A coalition of younger military officers, intellectuals, and moderate politicians who called themselves the New Korea Movement. Disillusioned with both the authoritarianism of Rhee's legacy and the chaos of the ongoing insurgency, they sought to reclaim Korea's future through decisive action. In April 1960, the New Korea Movement staged a bloodless coup in Seoul. They deposed Chang Myon's government with little resistance, citing the need to restore order and national unity. General Baek Do-hyun, once a hero of post-Rhee transition, was named head of the new military council. Their mandate was clear: end the war, stabilize the country, and reunify Korea on their terms. But even as they promised reform, the military government faced immediate challenges. Choi Myung-jin's forces controlled large swaths of the northern provinces. Foreign powers remained deeply involved, Washington wary of instability, Moscow and Beijing watching for openings to expand influence. In June, General Baek launched Operation Dawn, a coordinated military campaign aimed at recapturing insurgent-held cities and cutting off their supply lines. Using superior firepower and intelligence, the South pushed northward with brutal efficiency. However, the campaign came at a heavy cost. Civilian casualties mounted, infrastructure was destroyed, and the war's brutality deepened the divide between North and South. Reports of massacres and forced relocations fueled international condemnation. Meanwhile, Choi Myung-jin called on his followers to resist to the death, framing the conflict as a righteous struggle against Southern oppression. His propaganda machine intensified, broadcasting messages of unity through resistance and warning that surrender meant cultural and political erasure. By late 1960, Korea resembled a shattered mirror, fragments of hope reflecting back alongside images of violence and despair. In the midst of the chaos, Minseo and the Haenmaya movement persisted. They advocated for dialogue, peace, and recognition of the peninsula's complex history. Yet, their voices were drowned out by the roar of war and the clash of armies. As winter approached, the question hung heavy in the air. Could a nation torn by war, ideology, and betrayal ever truly find peace? Or was Korea doomed to repeat its cycle of division and violence indefinitely? Winter 1960. The Korean peninsula was a land cloaked in cold and conflict, with hope flickering like a fragile candle in a storm. General Baek Do-hyun's military government had tightened its grip on the South, pushing relentlessly against Choi Myung-jin's insurgency. Cities like Wonsan and Hwaryong were battlegrounds, scarred by shellfire and shadowed by fear. The cost of reunification through force was mounting. Countless civilians caught in the crossfire, infrastructure reduced to rubble, and the social fabric stretched thin. Yet Baek and his council believed they were Korea's last hope. For them, a strong, unified Korea under centralized military rule was the only path out of chaos. They implemented strict curfews, censored the press, and detained suspected insurgents without trial, but their iron fist only deepened divisions. Meanwhile, Choi Myung-jin's forces were changing too. The insurgency had evolved from a guerrilla movement into a quasi-government controlling northern provinces. Schools reopened under their administration, farms were collectivized anew, and basic services, however sparse, were restored. Choi's vision of a just Korea persisted, even as war raged. The international stage shifted as well. Moscow provided increased support, eager to expand its foothold in East Asia, while Beijing remained cautiously supportive, but non-committal. The United States, weary and distracted by crises elsewhere, debated whether to escalate or withdraw. Within Korea, ordinary people bore the heaviest burden. Families split by ideology, towns burned to ashes, and generations grew up knowing only war and suspicion. In Seoul, Minseo's Hanmae movement quietly persisted, holding secret meetings and distributing pamphlets that called for reconciliation. Their hope was to remind Koreans that beneath political fractures lay a shared heritage. As 1961 approached, a new hope emerged from an unlikely source. A young officer named Park Min-soo, educated abroad and disillusioned with endless conflict. Park advocated for a peaceful settlement, proposing negotiations between Baek's government and Choi's representatives. His ideas gained traction among moderate officers and civilians desperate for peace. Behind closed doors, back-channel talks began. But peace was fragile. In February 1961, a faction within the military attempted a coup to oust Baek, believing his methods too harsh and divisive. Though the coup failed, it exposed deep fractures within the government. Simultaneously, Choi's insurgents suffered a major defeat near Samjeon when a southern offensive, backed by new American intelligence, reclaimed the city. Choi retreated deeper into the mountains, rallying his followers for a final stand. The peninsula was teetering on the edge of total collapse, or breakthrough. In March, back-channel talks bore fruit, a tentative ceasefire agreement calling for demilitarized zones and joint economic commissions. It was far from peace, but a step toward it. Yet, as history often shows, the road to peace is never straight. Hardliners on both sides decried the talks. The Flame Legion in the south intensified attacks on perceived traitors. In the north, some commanders accused Choi of betrayal and plotted to break the ceasefire. As April 1961 dawned, Korea's future hung by a thread. Would the divided dream finally fall? Or would a new Korea rise from its ashes, one born not of war, but of fragile hope? April 1961. The Korean peninsula held its breath. After more than a decade of conflict, chaos, and shattered dreams, the fragile ceasefire had been signed. It was a peace of exhaustion, not triumph, a truce of grudges, not reconciliation. But it was a beginning. General Park Min-soo, rising in prominence, became the architect of the new order, a Korea that would attempt to heal by facing its fractured past rather than denying it. With his vision, the peninsula was divided not by hostile borders, but by zones of cooperation and cautious dialogue. The demilitarized zone, once a frozen line of war, became a buffer of tentative coexistence. Trade slowly resumed. Families separated by decades were reunited at guarded crossing points. Joint economic projects sprouted, shared power grids, cooperative fisheries, and cross-border rail links. The world watched with cautious optimism. Yet beneath this veneer of progress lay deep, unhealed wounds. The scars of war ran too deep to be erased overnight. Communities remained divided, memories of betrayal fresh. The Truth Commissions revealed atrocities committed by both sides, mass executions, forced relocations, and torture that shocked the nation. Accountability was uneven, and forgiveness remained elusive. Politically, Korea embarked on a difficult path toward federalism, a system balancing northern autonomy with southern governance. This new framework allowed for cultural differences, local leadership, and gradual integration. The challenge was immense, but it reflected a rare willingness to embrace complexity rather than impose uniformity. Internationally, the peninsula's new status altered the Cold War balance. The United States maintained a presence, supporting Korea's fragile democracy and economic development. Moscow and Beijing accepted the new order, wary but pragmatic. Korea became a unique example of Cold War détente, proof that even the bitterest divides could be negotiated. Yet the question lingered. Would this Korea be a nation united by peace, or a country forever split by history? In the decades that followed, Korea grew, but not without struggle. Economic booms in the South lifted millions out of poverty, while the North's tentative market reforms under local leaders improved living standards modestly. Cultural exchanges increased, as younger generations in both zones sought common ground through music, language, and family ties. Still, political tensions flared intermittently. Hardline factions in both regions resisted federalism. Periodic border skirmishes reminded all that peace was fragile. And the legacy of the Korean War, the trauma, the losses, the division, remained a ghost at every summit and dinner table. But perhaps most importantly, the people of Korea learned to live with uncertainty, to cherish the hope of unity while accepting the reality of division. The peninsula became a living testament to history's power, not only to divide, but to heal. A nation born from war, reshaped by conflict, yet striving to write a new story. So, what if the Korean War had united the peninsula? We imagined a Korea torn by war, but bound by shared blood. A nation rebuilt from ashes, struggling to reconcile ideology and identity. A land haunted by ghosts but reaching for hope. A story of resilience, pain, and the complex dance between unity and division. Would you want to live in such a world, where peace is never guaranteed, where history's wounds shape every day? Or would you choose the fractured reality we know, with all its challenges and possibilities? The answer lies not in history's past, but in the choices we make today. If this video stirred your thoughts, share your views in the comments. How do you see Korea's future, united or divided? And what lessons does this alternate history hold for us all? Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join the discussion below.